us online to this session of Ecosocialism 2024, Against War and Imperialism, People-to-People Solidarity in the Asia-Pacific region. My name is Sarah Hathaway. I'm from the Geelong branch of Socialist Alliance and I'll be chairing this session. I think by this point I can probably skip over some of the housekeeping. We've heard it a couple of times now. But for those online who might be joining us just for this session, want to acknowledge that Green Left and Socialist Alliance is the host of this conference, and if you're inspired to become a socialist activist, you can either join us or stay in touch. And I'm sure there'll be links online, or for those of you here in person, you can have a chat to Socialist Alliance members. I just want to acknowledge that we're holding this conference on the land of the Whadjuk Noongar people. This land was never ceded, it always was and always will be Aboriginal land. The Socialist Alliance stands in solidarity with Indigenous people in the ongoing fight for freedom from incarceration, land rights and genuine material sovereignty. So we've got three great speakers for this session. Our first speaker, Dana Langaswaran from Malaysia. Dana is a Malaysian socialist and labour rights activist in Perak State, where she runs a workers' helpline initiated by the Malaysian Socialist Party, or PSM, and the network of government contract workers, JPKK. Joining us online is Pedrosa from the Philippines. Aaron is the Secretary General of Sanlakas, a nationwide multisectoral coalition of grassroots and sectoral organisations in the Philippines fighting for genuine democracy. Aaron is currently a member of the Party of the Labouring Masses, PLM, Advisory Council. And our third speaker is Sam Wainwright. He probably doesn't need much of an introduction to those in the room. Sam is one of our national co-convenors of Socialist Alliance and part of Stop AUKUS WA. Sam is a former Fremantle City Councillor and active with the Refugee Rights Action Network. And Sam also writes regularly for Green Left. So for our comrades presenting, I'll try and give you a bit of a wind up at 15 minutes, if that's okay, and give us some time for questions and discussion. So without further ado, I'll hand over to Dana.
Hello everyone, how are you? Okay, so I'm given a huge topic today to talk. So I will try to share something that I bring from Malaysia. Okay, so let me start with introduction. Okay, so we are entering a new phase of global capitalism in which the US dominated a post-Cold War unipolar world order is crumbling. The old powers are in decline, but the new powers have yet to fully develop their strength. US imperialist hegemony is clearly in decline, but both in political and socio-economic terms. After the collapse of the Soviet Union, the US was the world's sole superpower. It had the economic and military strength and weight within global institutions to force other countries to implement neoliberal economic policies. But its military strength has been overstretched by its catastrophic military intervention in Afghanistan and Iraq. While the 2008 economic crisis has deeply impacted its economy. These factors have contributed to its declining influence, and the disastrous effects of US promoted neoliberal economic policies in many countries has led to the US losing credibility, which in turn has made it harder for the US to enforce its economic policies abroad. The US is trying to maintain its economic, political, and military superiority in the region, primarily by seeking to contain its main rival, China. So we can see this through the trade partnerships in pursues. The military alliance is its form, for example, the South Korea, Australia through the, I don't know how to pronounce it, AUKUS, and the new military base in it has opened in the Philippines. Meanwhile, we have the rising influence of emerging powers such as China, who are seeking to challenge US imperialism's dominance at the global level. We also have US allies such as Turkey and Saudi Arabia, establishing closer relations with countries that US deems as not friendly in order to help pursue their own geopolitical ambitions. While these smaller emerging powers might not be challenging US imperialism at the global level, they are advancing their own geopolitical interests at the regional level, in some cases seeking to revive dreams of past empires such as the Ottoman Empire in Turkey's case. In terms of China's role in the Asia-Pacific region, this is quite complex, with the exception of Vietnam, which China invaded over 4 decades ago. Most countries in the region have peacefully coexisted with China. More recently, however, China has triggered disputes in Southeast Asian waters by building artificial islands and sending Chinese military vessels to petrol dispute areas. This has created certain tensions and anxieties among governments in Southeast Asia over whether China poses a threat to their country. The ambition of Beijing to reunify Taiwan with China without abandoning the use of military mean to achieve this nationalist objective is also giving ammunition to the US imperialists to increase militarization in the region, thus creates instabilities and threats of war from time to time. The tensions in Korean Peninsula is also another flashpoint for intensified geopolitical conflict that will impact the people in Asia-Pacific region. So we are moving to Malaysian leaders, their different view and support. Like Mahathir Mohamad, he's more anti-USA. So in 2019, he said he would prefer to take sides with China over the USA if Malaysia was forced to take sides in trade war. If we see Anwar, the current Prime Minister, actually Mahathir is a previous Prime Minister, and now currently Anwar Ibrahim, Malaysian Prime Minister. He's a more pro-USA, but try to not picking sides amidst US-China geopolitical tension. In September 2023, efforts to attract more investment and trade to Malaysia continued to bear fruit through meetings with several USA giant companies. And in May 2024, Anwar received the delegation to maximize US-Malaysian business relationship. In a recent interview, he said he will continue doing business with China, but stressed that he had no intention to antagonizing the United States. And when we see the general public's opinion on USA and China, okay, during the Cold War and after the Cold War, Malaysia has been close to US and very strongly influenced by its policies and economic thinking. But more recently, due to the US decline and closer economic relationships with China, which has overtaken the US as our biggest trading partner, Malaysia has started drifting away from US influence. It is evident that government is moving closer to other countries, even if the US still has some influence in Malaysia. As for the general public, the large majority among the Malay community, which is around 60% of population, they are against US, actually because of the Palestine issue. So as we all know, so US also provide arms to Israel. So this is there is an ongoing boycott US and Israel products in Malaysia, and we also boycott some US food chains like McDonald's. So the Malaysian successfully closed down MACD in Malaysia. In some so, and when we move to Chinese community in Malaysia, it's around 24% of the total population. Okay, they are very happy with the emergence of China, and they are proud that China is developing strong against US in Taiwan issue. So they feel that US is being too aggressive with the regards to the Taiwan issue. So many Malaysians were not impressed with the way of US handled the COVID pandemic. And they are then unhappy that COVID vaccines were not made available to the poorer countries, but were stockpiled by the advanced countries. As for Malaysia, when disputes have emerged, for example, in the South China Sea, the government has not adopted an aggressive stand towards China. While protesting the fact that China vessels have crossed into Malaysian waters, it has refrained from beating the war drum. There are tensions, but not to extent that they threaten regional military conflict. Okay, so this is our stand, PSM assessment of the US and China. The economies of both the US and China are organized on capitalist principle. Goods are produced for profit and are exchanged in the market. Workers work for wages, and the big capitalists in both countries are getting richer and richer all the time. But there are significant differences between China and US, for example. The US Congress is controlled by the billionaires, the arms industry and giant pharmaceutical companies, but in China, the Communist Party is in control and has acted against the interests of certain groups of capitalists, like Alibaba, tuition industry, social media platforms. And second is the US foreign policy is greatly influenced by the military-industrial complex. As a result, the US regularly intervenes in other countries by using its military and started many wars. It also maintains hundreds of military bases around the world. Apart from its border war with Vietnam in 1979, China has not intervened militarily in any other country since the Korean War. And the US has a much higher GDP per capita, but it channels a lot of its economic surplus for the arms and the military, and not for the people. China, despite being poorer in the terms of GDP per capita, but has managed to utilize a significant part of the surplus to benefit the people. Transport, such as transport infrastructure, housing, healthcare, and to rapidly developing renewable energy. So, example, during COVID, China built a multi-story hospital in just 10 days. Okay? But there are many contradictions exist in China with the lack of workers' democracy and concentration of power in the hands of party bureaucrats. In PSM view, even though China and US both are capitalists, but when it comes to the practice and systems, China is better because it seems on the surface more concerned for the welfare of the people, as the government is controlled by the Communist Party and not by the billionaires and arms manufacturers, as in the case in the US. Malaysia is still not fully independent because it's built by elite group and imperialists. Still now the economy and politics are controlling by 1% billionaires, and elites thus not benefiting the people. And then if we see our actions against the war, actually I couldn't find picture for this thing. Actually PSM had mobilized and took part in global anti-Iraq war protests in front of US Embassy in Kuala Lumpur in 2003. Actually, I think that time is a global anti-Iraq war protest going, it's happened. So that time PSM also mobilized our members. And, okay, this is, okay, actually we are against the FTA, Free Trade Agreement. So we highlighted the bad effects of US-Malaysia FTA in 2008 and campaigned against it. It was called off, and TPPA negotiations started in 2013. So PSM protests by forming a coalition against TPPA. Okay. So we organizing campaigns, protests, gave memorandum against TPPA, and it was endorsed by the Malaysian government, but it was not implemented as a Trump withdrew the US from the agreement. The TPPA was then changed to CPTPP. It's a lot PP there. Okay, and then changed to CPTPP, and Malaysia has signed that agreement, despite the protest by the coalition that PSM is a part of. So we still against this kind of agreement. And then we also, PSM also led the protest against Syria attack in front of the US embassy to voice our opposition to the US plan to attack Syria and stop military action by US. So it's happened in 2018. And then, okay, this is a 2020. So PSM led the protest against Iran war outside US embassy, calling for an end to military action against Iran. It's in 2020. Okay, so this one is in 2023. PSM released statement to stop Ukraine war and handed memorandum to both European Union office in KL as well as the Russian embassy. Okay, so so Israel's genocide of Palestine, we have joined protests, marches, and rallies, released statements, and did some briefing session for our members about the conflict. We were also a part of a group that occupied a car park about 50 meters from the US embassy in Kuala Lumpur for a week. It started in February 2024. So our PSM youth wing leads the coalition called Gegar America that support Palestine and protested in front of US embassy. So this is some photos for the Palestine issue. So, okay. Okay, so we now moving to how we want to building the regional peace and solidarity. So actually, the prospect of building solidarity is there, but the left groups and people's groups in the region must work together for it. So actually, we got one declaration that signed in 1971. It's called ZOPFAN. Okay, ZOPFAN, its full name is Zone of Peace, Freedom, and Neutrality. So it's 5 founding states. So that time we are stressed about our commitment to respect for the sovereignty and territorial integrity for all states and the rights of every state, and large or small, to lead its national existence free from outside interference in its internal affairs. To this end, the neutralization of Southeast Asia was viewed as a desirable objective that should be explored and realized. But originally, ASEAN was established with the support of US to contain the influence of communism, shaping the terms of Sino-US competition and rapprochement, and deepening the US presence in Southeast Asia. Okay, so in June 2022, by a group of Southeast Asian left parties, including the PSM, raised the need to promote and advance progressive regional peace initiative. The statement lists certain peace initiatives, including the closure of all US military bases in the Asia Pacific, which we see as a main factor contributing to escalating tensions in the region. It also demands, among other things, the dismantlement of all imperialist intelligence infrastructure, upholding the Southeast Asia Nuclear Weapon Free Zone Treaty and expanding the Nuclear Weapon Free Zone Treaty to the entire Asia Pacific region. But another important peace initiative we need to take is bolstering working class solidarity and internationalism from below. We cannot just rely on governments. The movements, the grassroots need to promote solidarity against military escalation in the region wherever this is happening. For example, transnational grassroots movements could bring together different forces for joint actions on certain issues. If there is a conflict between countries, for example, there have at times been tension between Malaysia and Indonesia, we could get the left in both countries to demonstrate together to help diffuse tensions. Such actions could be very important, but more importantly, we need to organize movements at home capable of capturing political power. This would give us more space to promote peace and avoid conflicts among countries in the region. The left should be under no illusions that the emerging so-called multipolar world will help our struggles. Our struggles will always depend on the ground organizing and our ability to build movements capable of challenging the capitalist order. A multipolar world will not do this for us, of course. A multipolar world provides us with a new situation, new openings, new opportunities, and new challenges when it comes to organizing struggles. We need to understand these new dynamics that a multipolar world unleashes, but we should be under no illusions that a multipolar world is good for the left. The left, whether in government or opposition, should push Global South governments to uphold a position of non-alignment in the face of geopolitical rivalries among major powers such as the US, Russia and China, and refuse to support particular camps or be dragged into endless conflicts. That is not the way forward for the left. At the same time, non-alignment and non-interference in domestic affairs should not stop the left and progressive from building peoples to peoples movement and solidarity between struggles. As the left, we need to build solidarity while building a movement with a progressive program for international peace that is capable of taking power. We should have no illusions in right-wing governments and governments that only seek a better foothold within a multipolar world. It is meaningless to the working class to have a multipolar world if the same repressive regimes are in power. The issues are very difficult. There are still a lot of discussions to be had. Here in Malaysia, we are holding conferences and events to discuss debate these issues. How to deal with these new situations and dilemma for the left. What we need is a further discussions and greater understanding of, for example, China's rise, the new challenges we face internationally, and its impact on struggles domestically. We need more debates and discussion on enhance our understanding of the situation and develop more concrete and useful strategies for advancing our struggles without subordinating to the interests of the imperialism. So, I just want to share our youth wing. We are one of the members of this coalition called Gegar America. So this is formed for the Israel-Palestine issue. Okay, so it's got a lot of youth groups. So they are coming together under Gegar America. Okay, so this is the list of activities. So they are doing film screening, like handovers of memorandum, they got some activities. Actually, this third picture, so they got go and ambush the dinner actually, for Independence Day dinner. So they just go ambush, and so I think he got arrested. So this is when occupy the U.S. embassy in February. Okay, so they put a camp there and stay. Okay, so I think that's all. Say no to war, but for the peace. Okay, thank you.
Thanks so much, Dana. It's great to have you at our conference. I know Socialist Alliance and PSM have had a very long relationship, and Ange and I were lucky to go to your socialism conference last year, so look forward to reciprocating visits at future conferences. Our next speaker is Aaron, who's joining us on Zoom.
Yes, hello, good afternoon, comrades. Can you hear me?
Yeah, we can. Thanks, Aaron. Over to you.
Apologies, I could not make it. The Australian government did not give visa on time. It still says for further assessment. So I will be presenting our analysis into the geopolitical situation in the Philippines in the context of the continuing policy of containment of the US, which is focused on China, and how this has ramified in terms of military and political decisions, of course, to the detriment of our sovereignty and our interests as a democratic country. So, will I be sharing my screen, or are you sharing my screen? Maybe I'll just share my screen. It says your host disabled participant screen sharing. Okay. For the first slide is just a presentation of the facts that both the Philippines and China are signatories to the 1982 United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea, or UNCLOS. But what is not stated, and by the way, the UNCLOS was 1982, but formal accession of the Philippines happened in 1984, and for China in 1996. Even as China formally acceded to the UNCLOS, in 2006, it made explicit reservation that while it has decided to ratify UNCLOS, it continues to reaffirm its sovereignty over all of its archipelagos and islands, listed in Article 2 of the Law of the People's Republic of China on the Territorial Sea and Contiguous Zone. This was promulgated in 1992. Next slide. Under that same law, that includes maritime features being claimed to be within the exclusive economic zone of the Philippines. So there's this caveat to that accession to UNCLOS by China, a reservation made, that even as they agree to many of what's stipulated under that United Nations Convention, they maintain not just sovereign rights, but their sovereignty over Nansha Islands, which is Spratlys for the Philippines, as part and within their territorial sea. And since 2009, China has actually issued two diplomatic notes. This was still under former Chinese President Hu Jintao, claiming practically 90% of the South China Sea, under the pretext that China continues to hold historic rights over these islands. From a Western point of view, this has been called nine dash line. now expanded to 10 dash line to include Taiwan. But the Philippines does not lay claim on a historic basis, rather on by virtue of treaties entered into by its former colonial master, the US. No? And these are the treaties of Paris and treaties of Washington, by which the Philippines was formally ceded in the amount of 20 million US dollars, and later on in the hundreds of thousands of US dollars from the US, from Spain to the US. And part of the treaty, or more exact, in the Treaty of Washington, this included the features now being claimed by China. Take note, this was in 1898 to the early 1900s. These treaties were signed. And these treaties form part of the arguments of the Philippine government when the Philippines filed a complaint before the Permanent Court of Arbitration in 2012. And a year earlier, the Philippines, through former Akbayan Representative Walden Bello, passed a resolution renaming that portion of the South China Sea, which is part of the exclusive economic zone of the Philippines, as the West Philippine Sea. In 2016, as probably many of you know, the Permanent Court of Arbitration invalidated the 9-dash line and reaffirmed the Philippine government's, or the Philippines' sovereign rights over its exclusive economic zone under UNCLOS. Just for a brief understanding of what exclusive economic zone means, this actually begins reckon 200 miles from the territorial sea of the coastal state. In this case, the Philippines having exclusive rights to enjoy all the maritime and other resources found within 200 miles of its economic zone. China then started to build artificial islands in the South China Sea. Unfortunately, this included maritime features within the exclusive economic zone of the Philippines. But we must remember that it is not only China. In fact, the artificial islands built the most were by Vietnam, if I'm not mistaken, more than 20 of them in Paracel Islands. And there have been skirmishes between Chinese maritime personnel against Vietnamese, to the point that they are actually shooting each other. The relevance of the South China Sea and that portion of maritime pathway is that, according to China, or the China power, 80% of the world trade travels through that large swath of body of water, with an estimate of $5.3 trillion worth of commercial goods. This is a reiteration compared to the estimate made in 2016, which was a measly 21%, although that's significant already. Imagine if that crucial sea is blocked or contained, and world trade would suffer, also because many of the products are coming from China. Apart from the maritime, if you may call it, Silk Road, from the Chinese perspective, at least 7.7 billion proven barrels of oil reserves have been estimated to be found in the South China Sea, plus another 266 trillion cubic feet of natural gas reserves. So this makes the South China Sea and Southeast Asia as a whole an imperative geopolitical magnet for great power competition, which was well discussed by our Malaysian comrade. Apart from that, China has already announced in when Xi Jinping came into power, 2013, if I'm not mistaken, 2013, the trust or the direction to reverse China's century of humiliation. And part of that is to capture the leading role as an economic power, viewing US on a decline. after the fall, the decline of the Soviet Union, you have seemingly a unipolar world. The US dominates and has hegemony over the world with its junior partners, as we call them, including Australia, um, playing um, uh, second fiddle to the interests of that great superpower. But here is China challenging that. Um, and the most pronounced would be when it announced the Belt and Road Initiative. And now it has grown to the numbers you see on the screen. No? I don't know if are we on the same screen. This is the Belt and Road Initiative, where China currently has 151 partner countries with combined population encompassed or encapsulated at 5.1 billion people, 41 trillion combined GDP of all countries involved under the Belt and Road Initiative. Clearly, China is on its track to overtake the US in terms of economic clout, to say the least. No? And this is all in keeping with the aim to reverse the century of humiliation, reckoned from 1839 to 1949, from the Opium Wars down to the when Mao Zedong declared revolution in China. And by the Chinese timeline, a quarter of a century, or within a quarter of a century, it would have successfully overtaken US economy-wise, if not on all fronts, including perhaps military. But that's still more than 2 decades away. The real politic remains to be, and this is sorry, another slide, and then next slide, just to show the extent of the Belt and Road Initiative's progress. That is really already pervaded the Silk Road, including the Maritime Silk Road, as they call it, in the South China Sea. But this is on on the economy side. Next slide. Going back to US, despite the changes or recent changes in how past and present administrations have handled um, its policy, no? With its partners, including the approach to Asia in the context of China. The current administration under US President Joe Biden has and aims to reposition US as a global leading power, to not allow China to overtake and to dislodge its position as the hegemon. We've seen this in the time of Obama. There's a pivot to Asia strategy, but this was abruptly stopped at the time of Trump, who had a more protectionist approach to economics, no? And domestic affairs, even international affairs of the United States, more accurately captured in Make America Great Again, or MEGA, or MAGA. And then here you are, Biden, with a similar track taken by Obama. And this brings us to the policy pronouncements as captured in the different strategy papers issued by the US under Biden in the last 2 years. Next slide. When, for instance, in February 2022, the US unveiled its Indo-Pacific strategy, which targets China's mounting comprehensive national power. No? And the entire range of actions, no? Uh, prescriptions, if you may, so as to negate Beijing's ascending influence across Eurasia, Indo-Pacific's strategic environment. And then you have AUKUS, no? In the billions of dollars, the Australian government has provided the capacity, submarine capacity, which are nuclear powered, both by the UK and the US. And then you have the Quad, the arrangement which includes Japan now in the mix, which is mainly a security arrangement still intended to curtail, as one comrade calls it, in pursuit of the arc of denial around China. So that's from um, South Korea, Japan, South Korea, Taiwan, Philippines, New Zealand, Australia, and New Zealand. Next slide. In the same year, you have the NATO strategic concept, which openly declares the need to adopt a more hostile demeanor. To strengthen its forward defenses, we're not just looking at defenses as they are traditionally known, rather aggressive defense, if you may call it, in in terms of visibility, increasing the readiness of its forces, numbering to well over 300,000. For instance, while there is no troop mobilization by NATO in Asia, or in East Asia and part of Southeast Asia, NATO, because of US, has declared Taiwan as a strategic non-NATO partner. What does that mean? That remains to be seen, but in terms of support provided, whether diplomatically and pronouncements by the different governments, this means readiness to defend Taiwan against China. And this reverses the policy of ambivalence by previous administration to what they call now the policy of clarity, and that they are ready to defend Taiwan against China. Next slide. In the same year, October 2022, the United States White House publicly released its national security strategy. Going by that document, it just as if it falls short of naming China as an enemy. Next slide. In the US National Security Strategy paper, it recognizes the challenges in a post-Cold War era in terms of competition among major powers. And apart from this, the shared cross-border challenges, which includes many of the things that we are actually campaigning for: climate change, food security, insecurity, etc., etc. And the approach, while worded as such in the National Security Strategy paper, is as to be multilateral. It still asserts that the multilaterality of the approach must have at its helm the United States as the world's leading power. So next slide, the second bullet point, it recognizes in the same paper that that China is the only competitor with both the intent to reshape the international order and increasingly the economic, diplomatic, military, and technological power to advance that objective. So that the next slide, quoting some of the pronouncements of top US officials, they intend to overtake China within the decade, actually. When this what do I mean when they say this? When I say this, if China envisions itself to reverse a century of humiliation within the next quarter of a century, the US intends to overtake China in its capacity to be able to do that, because that poses as a single biggest threat to US hegemony within this decade, meaning from 2020 to 2030. Hence, these pronouncements, the need to act with urgency and creativity, and even the use of military force. So there's those strategies like integrated deterrence strategy. This means working closely with US allies and improving relations, especially allies who have been, how do you call that, who have been relegated to the periphery under Trump, in the attempt, for instance, to for the US to establish its dominance in the region under the Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement, which was derailed and botched by Trump. Now you have this strategy to draw in allies for the purpose of deterring China. And in terms of China, to continue investing in allies and aligning the priorities of these allies in their containment policy. So when we speak of the prospects of war, we speak of, as we said in the from BLM, part of the Labor Masses, my organization, as one that is not just a far-fetched idea, rather a real possibility. And we are looking at the increased militarization of the Philippines and the countries which are intended to contain China, up from South Korea all the way to New Zealand, no? To form that arc of denial against China. In the Philippine context, as mentioned by our Malaysian comrade, in 2014, when Obama peddled the idea of an enhanced defense cooperation agreement, this paved the way for the establishment of 5 military bases, which accommodates, these are Philippine military bases, accommodating US troops in Philippine soil. More than 3 decades after, or at that point, more than 2 decades after US military bases have been booted out of the Philippines, no? In 1991, when the Senate voted against the extension of the military bases in the Philippines. But by virtue of the Enhanced Defense Cooperation Agreement, we saw the return of US bases in 5 areas across the Philippines. And in the next slide, I will show which areas they are. And then just last year, 2 years even, there's this Strategic Civil Nuclear Cooperation Agreement, which the US has dangled for the Philippine government to accede to, intending to provide the Philippines nuclear capacity. Our 1987 Philippine Constitution does not allow nuclear weapons in Philippine soil. But by virtue of this nuclear agreement, there is suspicion that with the recent moves to change the Constitution, this would altogether mean allowing the Philippines to store nuclear weapons as in support of the US containment policy against China, especially in the context of the existing US bases accommodated in Philippine military bases. And then we are seeing more and more troop exercises, joint exercises between the Philippines and the United States. This year, 16,000 US troops with Filipino troops shoulder to shoulder in a show of force, again, directed against China. And I've mentioned AUKUS a while ago. Next slide. There's a map that you see. It shows from the 5 camps signed in 2014 under Marcos Jr., the present president, the current president. This has been expanded to 9 US bases, and there is an intention to add more US bases, more enhanced defense cooperation agreements with other countries, with other junior partners of US imperialism, including Australia. And that means more troops in the Philippines, more militarization, more military hardware coming into the Philippines in preparation for what we fear is an impending war. And we are looking at Philippine government under the present occupier of Malacanang, the counterpart of White House in the US, if you may. It has continued the hedging diplomacy of former President Duterte. Um, while there seems to be a balancing act between China and US over matters of economy, uh, unlike Duterte, Marcos Jr. has taken on the same position as his father, the deposed and ousted dictator, Ferdinand Marcos, in that his administration has practically made the Philippines another US puppet in the region, no? With the expansion of EDCA bases, with nuclear armament in the guise of nuclear weapons or actually nuclear capability enhancement, quote unquote, and the regular visits of high ranking US officials into the Philippines talking about matters of state and security. What is a fact? Although we have not received significant amount of military spending yet, they run in the hundreds of millions of dollars for now, unlike Israel or other countries to which the US is supporting. We are now part of that um, net, if you may, no? Reflecting the huge, the next, I'm now in the next slide, military spending of the US, especially consistent with its containment policy in China. Comrades are um, tackling the issue whether we should now categorize China as an imperialist country, another imperialism, so to speak. The next slide, it shows the presence of US military bases across the world. This is from Al Jazeera. 750 bases in at least 80 countries, and then troop deployment in 159 countries. This excludes the Philippines for now. The next slide, you will see countries with most number of US troops, and a number of these countries are located in Asia Pacific, including Japan, South Korea, Guam, Australia, among others. And countries with most number of US bases, again, you count many countries in the Asia Pacific. We point this out because unlike US, China has so far one military base, and it's located in Djibouti in Horn of Africa. So while we call out China for its continued incursion into our exclusive economic zone, that does not make China anything like US imperialism. The ambition might be to overtake US imperialism in terms of being a superpower, just like when there was a duality of powers during the Cold War era. But I think, and we take it as it would be folly to consider US as imperialism. Some comrades would perhaps say social imperialism, socialist in words, imperialist in deeds. But that could be discussed when we open the floor later. Next slide, just a rundown of the provocations, no? We call it the provocative acts between or committed by and instigated by the US through the Philippines against China. And these are just the recent provocations. The most recent one happened in June 17 when Chinese Coast Guards boarded um, pump boats, vehicles used by the Philippine Navy in its routine resupply mission to the second Thomas Shoal or the Ayungin Shoal, where you probably heard reports of a lost thumb, hacking, threats, etc. And all of a sudden, the once aggressive position taken by Marcos Jr., the war posturing, has taken a different tone. That the government said that was probably just a misunderstanding or an accident. You see, in the Philippines, there is now a sentiment to already use military force against China. Unlike Malaysia, 3 out of 4 Filipinos see China as a threat, according to a survey conducted in March. In April, 43% of the Filipinos trust the Americans more compared to China. So perhaps this is reflective of our um, past, no? As a colonial subject of the US. But and I end with this last slide. No? Our calls, no? After presenting the current context and situation of which the Philippines seems to be caught in an emerging crossfire between US and China. Our calls in PLM is to oppose US military expansionism in Asia, to dismantle all the camps, whether they are inside our own military camps or other or standalone camps, in formed along the coast of what we call the Arc of Denial, to demilitarize the South China Sea, rather than deploy forces in this area on in war footing, in preparation for war. It would take only one miscalculation for a war to actually happen, because of how it is going on right now, how the presence of military forces are actually overwhelming the South China Sea and part of it the West Philippine Sea, on the pretext of freedom of navigation, which is allowed under UNCLOS. When I presented the first few slides, there is prospect for oil and gas in the South China Sea and the West Philippine Sea in the billions of barrels or in the billions of tons. And in the context of a climate emergency, our position is to keep the oil and gas in the ground. There are sentiments, especially from our government, uh, to push for actually exploring and using these resources to catapult the Philippines into in the league of Singapore, for instance. No? But in the context of a climate emergency, where the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change has given us until next year for global greenhouse emissions to peak, our interests as a vulnerable country, a poster child of the climate crisis, is not to add to our vulnerability, but rather to contribute to climate action. There's an ongoing talk of an ASEAN Code of Conduct on the treatment of South China Sea. And we feel this is consistent with our view to treat the maritime resources as a common, something that should be mutually benefited from by all parties and not to be owned by one. And this is perhaps a confusing quote. I said in one action, the West Philippine Sea is ours, meaning it belongs to the Philippines, but it is not ours to own. It belongs to humanity. In the context of global hunger, in the context of the climate crisis, the preoccupation should be not for war, not to support the imperialist agenda, not to be not to find ourselves in the crossfire, not to be a cannon fodder for the US, rather to stand for an independent foreign policy, which would only happen if the oppressed people, the peoples of Southeast Asia, is supported by the movements of the different parties, socialist, communist, progressive parties across Asia Pacific, would mount the strong solidarity against military expansionism. So I end my talk there. Thank you.
Thanks, Aaron. And our last speaker is Sam Wainwright.
All right, thanks, comrades, and thanks, Aaron. And it's really bitterly disappointing that Fortress Australia refused you a visa, Aaron, along with Amar. It's a permanent struggle for us when we organise these conferences that comrades from the Global South are refused visas, or in the case of Amar and Aaron, they just get processed indefinitely. And we write to them and say, what's going on? Oh, it's being actively processed against the criteria. Whereas we know what's actively happening is it's just sitting in a pile and they're doing nothing, you know. But those visa applications for Aaron and Amar are still live, and if they eventually come through, well, then we hope to see them at the next Ecosocialism conference next year, and more about that later. Okay, so on to our topic. It's clear that Western imperialism, big Western capitalist countries, with the US at its centre, still dominate the world. This domination is maintained through economic subjugation and war, and demonstrated most recently to us by the unconditional support by the United States for Israel and the unconditional pipeline of money, weapons and diplomatic support. US officials themselves describe Israel as, quote, our unsinkable aircraft carrier in the Middle East. And that's the strategic function that Israel plays for US capitalism means we will never get any more than lip service from Biden. That's why there are no red lines for Israel. And that reality is very obvious to the majority of people in the world. For 85% of the population that lives in the Global South, they understand perfectly well the hypocrisy of the West on these questions. I mean, it's one good thing you could say about this awful crisis in Palestine is at the moment is that hypocrisy is now a little bit more apparent to Western radicals. Only 18 months after we were condemning Russia for illegal invasion of Ukraine and international law and human rights and all that sort of stuff, all of a sudden that doesn't matter. 18 months later, that's out the window. People in the Global South were aware of that hypocrisy all along, but the United States has demonstrated that in spades to world opinion. However, at the same time, as the previous speakers have observed, US hegemony is still declining, as evidenced by the emergence of other capitalist states that pursue their own interests in contradiction to and sometimes outright conflict with the West, the so-called multipolar world. Now, it's in this context that the US is absolutely determined to block China's growth, both economically and militarily. And this is the main driver of escalation of tension in our region. And it's worth stepping back and thinking about the contradiction that's got us to this point. So, you know, I think people are aware of the ludicrous hypocrisy of Trump running around saying, you know, China's taking our jobs, you know. Well, no, Western capitalism very consciously moved sections of its production to China and other countries of the Global South in order to make greater profits. They did it, you know. They killed the jobs in the American Rust Belt, quite consciously did so, and made huge profits out of it. So there's all of this, you know, China's getting rich at our expense. Through this process, don't understand this very clearly. Yes, China has industrialised, but Western capitalists have made even more profits through this process up to this point. But an interesting thing about China is the Chinese state, of course, is a product of the Chinese Revolution. And so it's never been a kind of a subordinate puppet of the United States. And the Chinese state is trying to leverage that industrialisation that's happened, you know, by essentially subcontracting the West's more dirty, dangerous, polluting, and less high-tech industry. It's trying to take that and then use that as a platform, as a lever, to start to develop sections of its own economy that might catch up with the West. So the Chinese state actually has a conscious plan, you know, that they understand the contradiction as well and are trying to use it to their advantage. And the United States has kind of started to wake up to this, you know. And so the message from the United States is very clear. You can make our fucking washing machines, but you're not having AI and you're not making semiconductors. You know, it was good insofar as it went, but that's as far as you're going. I mean, that is put bluntly, is the basic policy of the United States. And that is now law. So if you're an American citizen or an American permanent resident, it is illegal for you to work for a Chinese firm that's trying to develop semiconductor industry. It's a crime, you know. So there's a very clear agenda of the US. Now, whether the United States actually could catch up to the West economically across its entire economy is a whole nother discussion we could have, right? So, I mean, it is incredible what China has achieved over the last 30 years. Like, if you measure in terms of labour productivity, 30 years ago, labour productivity in China was only 1/8 of what it was in Western countries, right? So, in 1 hour of work, a worker in Germany or the United States would make 8 times as much value in goods and services as what they did in China. And that sort of differential is still typical between countries of the global south and the developed global north countries. But China has halved that, so the differential is down to, it's now 4-1. Now, could China actually catch up to the West? Because in our media, it's just presented as this inexorable kind of China's getting more technology and it's growing and it's getting wealthier and it's just happening and it's happening. And we tend to see the images from the east coast of China. Cities like Shanghai look very modern, that sort of stuff. We should remember that that's not true across the whole of the Chinese economy. If you go out to rural China, that 1-4 differential reasserts itself. Now, could China catch up to the West by following the economic model that it's followed up to this point, which we can have a debate about the role of the Chinese state and is China as a whole socialist or capitalist? People won't take that up in discussion, but broadly speaking, it's still been a capitalist development model with intensive state intervention. Now, I'm not sure that it could, because if China was to become a global north country, that would lift the population of the global north from being 15% of the world's population to like 30% of the world's population. And then ask yourself, in a capitalist development model, how could that happen without either massively intensifying the exploitation of the people of the global south? Because that's why the global north is rich. You've got to always remember these categories are codependent. It's not like you've got rich countries over here and you've got poor countries over here and they just kind of both fell from the sky. No, the rich countries are rich and the poor countries are poor because the rich countries extract wealth from the poor countries, right? So could that happen? Could China reach our standard of living following a capitalist development model without one of these three things? Massively intensifying the exploitation of the people of the global south. Well, I don't know that they're going to cop it, I don't think they can. Massive intensification of the exploitation of planet Earth, or a redivision of the division of labour, and China displacing an existing imperialist power, which of course means war, I think all those three things are in the mix and part of what's going on. I haven't got comprehensive answers to those questions because I seriously don't know them, but I think that's part of what's going on. Well, while the drumbeat coming from the US and Australian governments and the capitalist media in our countries constantly hypes up so-called Chinese aggression, and just as an aside, as an example of that, so the Australian Institute did a poll. Now, 4 years ago, 54% of Australians had a positive image, according to their poll, a positive image of China's role in the world, and today that's plummeted to 16%. And you actually think, so what in the last 3-4 years has happened? I mean, we can have plenty of criticisms of the Chinese government, right? But what has China done that's so bad towards Australians to cause that change? Well, nothing's happened. China hasn't done anything. What has happened is there's been an anti-China drumbeat in our media, which has influenced ordinary working people. I'll come back to that in a moment. Okay, so the so-called the so-called threat of Chinese aggression is constantly drummed up. It has been really very deliberately drummed up in our media in the last 3-4 years. But it's important to understand that China's response has been, in essence, fundamentally defensive. It is the one that is being encircled by US military bases, alliances, and missile systems. So in our media, it's always, what do we do about Chinese aggression? Chinese aggression that, Chinese aggression this. What about US aggression? What about Australian aggression? That's the question that's never posed in our media. And it's a terrifying reality that the United States may even be seeking to provoke a war with China, one which it will undoubtedly blame on some act of Chinese aggression, real or imagined. If there's no real one, they'd be prepared to make it up. And this is the human and environmental consequences of such a conflict is quite literally the stuff of our worst nightmares. But we should remember that this is what capitalism is. capitalism is war. You know, for those of us who live in the global north, since the Second World War, we've lived through the period of kind of Pax Americana, where the United States was the preeminent imperialist power and was able to decide the rules, and the other imperialist powers functioned as vassal states, like Japan, Western Europe, Australia, and we just went along under the umbrella of the United States. The sort of the era of the big anti-imperialist wars that we saw in Second World War and First World War seem to be behind us. Of course, for people in the global south, it's never been, you know, it's been constant war. There's never been peace since the end of the Second World War for people in the global south. But for us in the global north, we've been able to sort of stumble along in the illusion that, oh, you know, war is not going to penetrate our lives. But we're sort of, in that sense, we're returning, capitalism is you know, that cycle has exhausted itself, and we're returning back to normal capitalism. Capitalism is war. So while I've said that China's response has been fundamentally defensive, nonetheless it's true that in its determination to break out of this encirclement, this sort of strangulation effect that the United States is trying to impose, and preserve its access to maritime trade routes, it has also had a policy of riding roughshod over its near neighbours in the South China Sea, as we heard from both Dana and Aaron. And I think so. It's important for us in socialists in Australia, who are part of this aggressive alliance to Australia against China, both to call that out, but simultaneously defend the sovereignty of Vietnam and the Philippines and Malaysia against China throwing its weight around. The other thing I just want to briefly touch on is this. Australia's embrace of this US aggression towards China comes coupled at the same time as now a sort of a 2-decade bipartisan policy to make Australia a major arms exporter. There's a real, you know, there's a determination that Australia can be a big arms exporter on the world stage, and with, you know, the consequence of that, for instance, is Australia exporting arms to Saudi Arabia. So, you know, the arms exports to Israel have been in the media a lot recently for us for obvious reasons, but, you know, Australian weapons have been used, obviously, to help fuel the war in Yemen, a war that's cost 200,000 lives. That's what Saudi Arabia does. And Australian weapon systems have been used on armoured personnel carrier that have literally shot at sub-Saharan African refugees trying to cross the Red Sea onto the Arabian Peninsula and shot on the beaches of Saudi Arabia. Okay, so why has Australia locked in behind this really dangerous US project? Now, the shared global military interventions and projects of what I call the Anglo-imperialist powers, led by the United States, but with Britain, Australia, Canada, under the leadership of the US, and demonstrated through things like the invasion of Iraq or the Five Eyes Intelligence Alliance, don't just flow from our shared language and culture, although that's part of it and it kind of reinforces it, but also flows from tightly overlapping economic interests. So despite all the fear-mongering in our media, and especially by the far right, about the Chinese buying the farm and taking over Australia, it's been the case for a long time that the United States and Britain are the biggest sources of foreign direct investment in Australia by a long way, and they are also the biggest destinations of Australian investment by Australian capitalists as well. And so that, you know, so there's actually there's an interpenetration of investment by US, British and Australian capital. And so when former Australian Prime Minister John Howard described Australia on the brink of the invasion of Iraq as the, quote, deputy sheriff in the Asia Pacific, he did actually, I mean, as infuriating and as humiliating it was for us, that's accurate. He accurately described Australia's place in the world and its relation to its near neighbours, the United States as deputy sheriff. Of course, for Australia, there is a particular contradiction in joining this aggressive push to contain China, given that China is at the same time Australia's largest trading partner for both imports and exports. Now, so why do this? I mean, Australian capitalism, you know, there's an obvious contradiction there. Australian capitalism constitutes a mid-sized imperialist power in its own right, and could instead adopt a relatively neutral position and seek trade with China and the US on its own terms. Trade with both, you know, not enemies of either. And this, of course, as many of you know, is the position that's effectively advocated by former Labor Prime Minister Paul Keating. And for younger comrades, Paul Keating's no hero of workers or the left. I can tell you, for older activists here, Paul Keating, very much introduced neoliberalism under a Labor government in Australia. In fact, my first year of university, 1989, was when HECS was introduced by his government. University was free up to that point, and we heard in one of the workshops before about East Timor, and his government, Labor government, was the one that gave diplomatic, military, and financial support to the Indonesian occupation of East Timor at the cost of 300,000 lives, right? So, Paul Keating's not motivated by sort of, left-wing ideals like us. But it's interesting the basis of his objection. Now, how many big capitalists or senior policymakers shared his view, I don't know. But it seems very clear that a decisive majority of senior bureaucrats, Labor and Liberal politicians and Australian capitalists have decided to fall in behind the US plan, notwithstanding its contradictions. And this has been accompanied by a call to reduce Australia's reliance on trade with China, but it's not clear how successful this really will be. Australian capitalists, of course, want the best of both worlds. They want to join the US in blocking China's development, by force if necessary, while continuing to trade with it. And China has recently reduced some of its tariffs on Australian imports, but that contradiction hasn't really been resolved. Well, I think one thing that's interesting for us just to pause and think about before we move on is to reflect on how the AUKUS decision was being made. Like if you join a socialist group like ours or any socialist group, invariably there'll be an introduction session, and one of the things we'll talk about is the nature of the state under capitalism, where you'll be told that the state under capitalism is not neutral, even though working people won the right to vote over 100 years ago, massive struggle for universal suffrage, they extended to women and Aboriginal people, that sort of stuff. The state is not a neutral institution. In the last analysis, it serves the interests of the capitalists, blah, 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 right? I could go on. And the AUKUS decision just bears that out so starkly. So a decision to spend more than $368 billion of taxpayers' money, so our money, committing us to this massive expenditure on nuclear submarines. And it's not just the nuclear submarines. By the time you add in the HIMARS missile systems, the F-35s, all the other bits and pieces that they're talking about, we're talking about $500 billion. So a decision to commit that amount of money, number one, and a decision to commit the Australian state to a military confrontation with China is not even brought to an election. In fact, Albanese didn't even take it to the party room. So that was a decision that was hammered out behind closed doors between the trusted front Labor and Liberal front benches and the top security experts in the Australian state. They got consensus and then announced the decision as a united front. We get to vote on whether we get the Labor version of neoliberalism or the Liberal version of neoliberalism, or who gets to stay or get voted off Dancing with the Stars or whatever. And yet a decision of that magnitude cannot be taken to an election. They can't even they couldn't even take it to a Labor Party conference first. They couldn't even allow the possibility that the sort of pro-capitalists with a different point of view, like Paul Keating, couldn't be allowed to be part of the debate at the outset. No, it had to be locked in and then flow, total top-down decision-making. You can make all your jokes you like about China or North Korea or whatever, absolutely top-down decision-making, a question of that importance. If you ever needed any evidence that the really important decisions that affect our lives are made behind closed doors with zero democratic input, that is it. Okay. This decision of the Australian ruling class and its political servants to embrace the US war drive against China now fundamentally shapes Australian politics, and opposing it is a primary strategic task for socialists in this country, and any progressive, to be frank. The AUKUS plan to produce nuclear submarines in conjunction with the US and UK is coupled with the US-Australia Force Posture Agreement and flows from the US pivot to Asia, which Aaron talked about, and that began under Obama. So, as Aaron said, there's been continuity between Obama, Trump, Biden. They all agree on this stuff. And among other things, it allows for a significant increase in interoperability of Australian and US armed forces, more access by the US to Australian bases, B-52 bombers carrying nuclear warheads to be based on Australian soil in Darwin, or near Darwin, Tyndall Air Base, for US military intelligence to be embedded within Australia's defence intelligence organisations, and new intelligence bases. So in addition to Pine Gap, we've now got one up near Geraldton. And even before the AUKUS submarines arrive, if they arrive, it means US and British nuclear powered and surely armed submarines, they won't tell us if they're armed, but of course they are. They're scarcely going to take the nuclear missiles off the submarine while they call into an Australian port and then go to another port and then put the nuclear missiles back in, right? This is not going to happen, right? And so bear in mind what that means if you're a citizen, if you live in the Greater Perth region. So that means each one of those submarines has got 5 times as much radioactive material than the bombs that were dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And accidents do happen with nuclear submarines. I mean, that tells us how safe they are. But of course, the greater the risk, the safer the thing something has to be, right? And there are 9 nuclear submarines lying on the ocean floor. 5 former Soviet ones, 4 US ones. And eventually under the pressure of the ocean and the corrosion, well, presumably those reactors are going to burst open and, humanity and planet Earth is going to have to deal with the radioactivity that seeps out of those things. And by making us part of a nuclear alliance against China, they do make us a nuclear target as well and increase the likelihood of nuclear conflagration. For young people now, there's the huge kind of anxiety about climate change. When I was like 8, 9 years old, the anxiety was about the possibility of nuclear war, Older comrades will remember the book, When the Wind Blows by a guy called Raymond Briggs. And I haven't got time to go into what it was, really unpack it for you, but it's a cartoon kind of book, and it tells the story of a very naive, well-meaning, working-class British couple who just believed what the government told them. And there is a nuclear strike, and they do the things that the government says, like boil their water and all this sort of stuff. Of course, and the second half of the book is really their slow death from radiation poisoning. And when you grew up in that era, the thing which frightened you more than dying suddenly in a nuclear strike was dying slowly. Taking 2 weeks to die from nuclear poisoning with your teeth and your hair falling out and internal bleeding and all that sort of stuff. And when I was 8 years old, I said, and as kids you grew up with that, right? When I was 8 years old, I said to my dad, serious true story. I was about 8, 9 years old. I said to my dad, because I was aware of this, I'd read this book. I said, what if you found out? I lived in Canberra at the time. I said, Dad, what if we found out that there was going to be a nuclear confrontation and a missile was going to land on Canberra? What would you do? And he said to me, I'd put you and your sister in the car and I'd drive to the spot where the bomb was going to land. And he said that to an 8-year-old, and I accepted that, as being necessary and what we would do. And of course that threat had never completely went away, and now it's come roaring back, and it's coupled with the climate crisis. The announcement of the AUKUS deal was preceded, as I said, by a concerted media campaign about China. Of course, the notion that China was going to sabotage its own trade with Australia was completely ludicrous, or could invade and that sort of stuff. That started to crumble apart. The threat narrative around China tends to fall back a lot on both the fear that China might invade Taiwan and the focus on the authoritarian surveillance features of the Chinese state. Some of which are pretty horrendous, And I spoke at a forum on behalf of Stop AUKUS a few months ago, at a Politics in the Pub event in Fremantle, and talked about the massive expenditure on AUKUS, how mad it was, everything else we could do with the money, all that kind of thing. There was someone in the audience who sort of said, look, I get all that, but at the end of the day, we either have to live under US hegemony or Chinese hegemony. So I'd prefer US hegemony. That's how some people perceive it. Especially if you live in the global north, you can kind of think like that. People in the global south don't have that luxury. But okay, Socialist Alliance believes that the US, as I said, that the US and its allies are the primary aggressors and responsible for these rising military tensions. That said, it doesn't diminish our belief that the people of Taiwan, for instance, have a right to self-determination, and that any attempt by China to forcibly annex Taiwan would be a terrible mistake. As some of the other speakers have pointed to, we're also grappling with this so-called multipolarity, so the emergence of capitalist states that aren't under the direct tutelage of the United States. And the Russian invasion of Ukraine really brought that out very, 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 very sharply. As and navigating this question of the Russian invasion of Ukraine has been a complex one for the left. The approach of Socialist Alliance has been twofold. First is to impose the Russian invasion, is to avoid what we think is 2 mistakes, or 2 kind of crude reduction in relation to the Russian invasion of Ukraine. The first mistake is just to oppose the invasion, but ignore the obvious fact that Western governments don't support Ukraine because they care about international law or the Ukrainian people. Rather, they just want to inflict a humiliating defeat on Russia and break up its ability to play an independent role in world affairs. The second mistake would be to reduce the invasion to a proxy war between NATO and Russia and just dismiss the aspirations of the Ukrainian people as of secondary importance and not important. Because the most extreme expression of this view positions Russia as a standard bearer for the global south. In my opinion, the following is very clear. To think that the Russian invasion has advanced the material and political position of the working people of Ukraine, Russia, or the global south is wrong. Furthermore, it's given the West, governments in the West, a basis to promote their own significant increase in military expenditure and their posture. All right, I will skip the rest of that. That's okay. Only to say that while we should absolutely reject attempts by the United States to push its way around the world saying we're the only ones that can have a sphere of influence and we're going to use force to stop Russia or China or any of that sort of stuff, why we should oppose that, we should also not have illusions that some pretty brutal capitalist regimes in places like Turkey and Russia or Saudi Arabia are the spearhead for our fight for liberation and going to turn things around for us. Okay, from this swirling mess of contradictions and naked self-interest by capitalist regimes, the only durable and dependable force is working class solidarity across borders, regardless of whether or not the local ruling class is tightly aligned with US imperialism, like us, or in another country like Iran. It may be hard for us to imagine now, but socialists need to patiently and persistently advance this perspective in argument and practice. And we need to advocate today for people-powered or people-to-people peace initiatives, like the ones that Dana and Aaron have been talking with. Of course, in Australia, that has to start with opposing AUKUS and the whole US alliance, which is a big deal in Australia because loyalty to the US alliance is kind of a bit like loyalty to the British Empire was 100 years ago. It's God strike me down if I even that sort of stuff. You're a heretical traitor, that kind of thing. But we have no choice. It's the demand that we have to raise. We should be seeking to rekindle a sense of working class internationalism. And our job is to help Australian workers realise that our immediate enemies are our own ruling class, not working people in other countries. And that means breaking down monolithic conceptions about what working people in other countries are like. I didn't do slides, but I did bring one prop. We did a Stop AUKUS protest a couple of months ago outside one of these weapons. There's all these businesses that are trying to get on the AUKUS submarine gravy train down in Kwinana Sound, and just to sort of fuck with the heads of the militarists, we did bilingual signage in Australian and Chinese. But it also had a more profound purpose of us starting to think about how do we actually reach out to Chinese workers. We want to dialogue with Chinese workers, not necessarily the Chinese government, but Chinese working people. That's a serious thing that we have to do. So we had a whole bunch of signs with different slogans, including that one. For socialists in the region. We need to talk about peace initiatives that emphasise the necessity for cooperation and that build understanding and a sense of common humanity across borders. And just to come back to AUKUS, there was that initial surge of outrage at the cost of AUKUS, and then, I don't know about you, for a lot of us, I sort of felt a bit kind of deflated when that sort of outrage kind of faded away and people just got on with their lives and, oh, well, that's just part of the furniture now. I'm like, no, just keep being angry, people, for fuck's sake, But it's a slow burn. It's going to come back, right? Because you think about how it weaves into all the other struggles that we're going to face when fighting for environment and social justice in this country in the coming years. So the neoliberal attacks, we've got to cut back on the NDIS. Well, hang on a sec, you've got half a $1 trillion for weapons. We know it's true with Palestine. A country like Australia that is totally embedded in this US alliance against China is not going to be able to call out the United States on another key strategic question like Palestine. It can't do it. To break one is to break the other. And it's why we, when we're campaigning around Palestine, should be raising that issue of close Pine Gap. Because Pine Gap is being used to feed military intelligence to Israel. And of course, probably the biggest one is the climate crisis. we've got a government in Australia that says that it's serious about confronting the climate crisis. We know all the ways it's not serious, but just step back and ask yourself this question. If you are planning to spend well over $400 billion on weapons and gearing up for a new Cold War, are you preparing to fight climate change? No, you're not. Can you do both? No, you cannot. And this is something that we need to patiently talk to other climate activists about. If you think you can somehow ignore AUKUS, you are absolutely dreaming. You know, some people say to you, oh, you know, the Australian ruling elite, they don't have a serious plan for climate. They do have a fucking serious plan for climate. Okay, it's a war for resources. It's repression. Oh, you think if 200 million Bangladeshis lose their homes because of rising seawaters, because of a climate crisis they never caused, do you think the Australian government's going to go, oh, well, fair enough, we're global north, we'll do our share? No way, they've got their plan. Stop the boats. They've got their plan. So that is their plan for the climate crisis. War for resources, repression, and where needed, fascism. That's their plan. That's their plan for the climate crisis, right? They do have a plan. As I said, they have a very serious plan. And that's why we need to mobilise people for a foreign policy based on climate justice and social justice as an absolutely indispensable plank of our fight to stop runaway global warming and to create a livable planet for all.
Thanks, comrades. So we've had 3 very comprehensive talks and I've been a useless chair. So we don't have time for discussion, I'm sorry. But we want to thank Aaron for zooming in and to thank all our comrades for really brilliant talks I've given us. So thanks again, comrades.